Big bad bush with a bag look. Could have been a Brizzy or a MacBook. All right, look. Jorge Masvidal has got his Twitter fingers out today. He's been tweeting. He's gone on a tirade, as they say. He's gone on a tirade. He's been tirading about the fact that he's not happy with what he's been offered by the UFC to face Kamaru Usman for the welterweight championship of the world. Is tirading even a word? I don't know. I don't even know what day it is. I don't know what month we're in. I don't even know what time it is, because this lockdown is like Groundhog Day. It's the same thing over and over and over again. But the MMA world keeps on spinning around. So Jorge Masvidal's tirade, he started off saying, if I'm not worth it, let me go, at ESPN. Don't know why he asked ESPN. I don't know what ESPN are going to do for him in this situation, but he added them. Someone responded to that saying, just when everyone thought it was Usman holding up the fight, that geezer with his head in his hand, Jorge Masvidal said, they told me he asked for way too much. They playing us. They playing us. I'm not going to read every single tweet, but effectively one of the things that he did say is, why make me fight for half of what I made on my last fight because the other dude can't draw? So basically what he's saying is he's been offered half the amount he made in his last fight. And now he's in a title fight. So in theory, when you fight for a title, that's the pinnacle of any fighter's career. And when you reach the pinnacle, what should come with that is your biggest payday. That's the general consensus, the general logic. And then he spoke about how don't tell me about a pandemic when reports today show highest stock market has ever been, everybody getting back to work and you buying an island, stop playing us and the fans, hashtag the awakening, no longer the resurrection. Look, all of this stuff is very familiar because about a week ago, John Jones was doing the same thing. John Jones was basically arguing over the same thing. The situation was slightly different, but the principle was the same. You're not paying me what I'm worth. You're not paying me enough. What do both of these guys have in common? The management team, the Kawa brothers. Now, I am no detective, but if I had to bet £10, I'd bet if the John Jones thing didn't happen last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever it was, this situation wouldn't be playing out so publicly on Twitter the way it is now. This explains why Jorge Masvidal on Twitter was calling out Nate Diaz and asking for the second fight with Nate Diaz. Because clearly they've been in negotiations with the UFC for the Kamaru Usman fight and they've not been happy with the offers that they've been made. So they thought, all right, well, hold on. If we've earned, in their words, twice as much in our last fight, let's just go and fight that dude again. Because if that means that we're earning more money, that's what we're doing it for at the end of the day. Fuck your title. You can keep your title. We'll just fight this guy and make twice the amount of money. That's the logic behind it. But here's my thing. I've said this since I started making these videos, that it's clear as day that Jorge Masvidal doesn't do his own tweets. It's just the language that's used and the way these tweets come across. You can kind of clearly see that someone else is tweeting on his behalf. Now, Jorge Masvidal is a grown man, and if he's allowed someone to tweet on his behalf, then he's letting someone put words in his mouth, so he has to stand by that. I'd be a little bit wary of whether Jorge Masvidal is 100% in line with what his management team are saying on his Twitter account today. I don't know that I don't know either way. Do you know what I mean? I don't know. But what I will say is they're clearly not happy with how the stuff went down with John Jones last week. And I do believe that is affecting what has happened with Jorge Masvidal today. The problem that they've got is these are two individuals that are basically making a stand against the UFC. And we've seen this story play out time and time again, and how the UFC deal with these kinds of issues. They just ignore them. They just ignore fighters like this who go out on these tirades. None of these guys have enough power to affect the kind of change that they want. Another thing that is a major issue with this specific situation is the Kawa brothers are some of the biggest they're one of the biggest management team in MMA, but very publicly they don't get along with Ali Abdelaziz. And it's funny because they'd have a lot more power collectively, but with the management teams not seeing eye to eye with each other, one thing that they enjoy is getting one over on the competition. And there's instances where you feel like they're using fighters that they manage as pawns in this game that they've got going on between each other. I'm not saying that's going to happen now, but I am saying that their bargaining position is weakened when they go public like this. And it leaves the door open for another management company to say, oh, my fighter will fight for X amount. Yeah, we'll take that fight. That's not a problem. The fighter will be like, yeah, I'll have that fight. I don't know who Gilbert Burns' manager is, but I mean, he's happy and he's open to fighting Kamaru Usman, and he won't be putting up a fuss and fight when it comes to his paycheck for that fight. Do you know what I mean? There's a reason why the welterweight rankings were released earlier this week, and Gilbert Burns was placed as the number one guy in that division. Dana White today in the press conference said, oh, Gilbert Burns is the number one guy. He's not the fucking number one guy. Don't get me wrong, he's a good fighter. Don't get me wrong, he's had some impressive victories. Don't get me wrong, he's on a run. He's on a roll. But he hasn't beaten enough people in that welterweight division to warrant him being the number one ranked fighter. And this makes me believe more and more that the UFC have a heavy influence on who is ranked where. Because when these rankings first came out, whenever they came out, years and years ago, it was meant to be kind of MMA media outlets that get to vote and say who they believe is ranked where in each division. I just think it's way too convenient that the UFC have been having these negotiations with Kamaru Usman and Jorge Masvidal, been going on for weeks now, and all of a sudden Gilbert Burns just finds himself in the number one slot. Like, if you look at who Jorge Masvidal has beaten in his last 3 or 4 fights in the welterweight division, compare it with Gilbert Burns, there's no way anyone can argue that Gilbert Burns' run has been more impressive than Jorge Masvidal's. If you look at, I know Covington lost to Kamaru Usman, but just because Covington's lost to Kamaru Usman in his last fight, he shouldn't slip below Gilbert Burns in the rankings. It just doesn't make sense. Leon Edwards hasn't lost since TVs were black and white. Why is he where he is in the rankings? How has Gilbert Burns leapfrogged him? Like, it's illogical. Unless you're the UFC. Unless you're the UFC and you're trying to put people in a position to show that they deserve a title shot because the guy that you actually really want to fight for the title isn't playing ball, isn't taking the payday that you think he deserves for this fight. If there's a discrepancy, if there's a gap in your analysis and his analysis in what they think this fight deserves in terms of a purse. And that's the crux of the matter. That's the long and short of it. Because so as long as these fighters try and make a stand as an individual, they're not going to win. The UFC will just slot someone else in there. And then you're just hindering yourself. You're just sat on the sidelines waiting, scratching your ass, sniffing your fingers, and then you think, fuck it, I might as well go back to work. Because it's not gonna work. You're not gonna win. One of the things that Jorge Masvidal said here, if we're independent contractors, because Dana White said it in the press conference, oh, these guys are independent contractors, man, we can't control them. All we can do is offer them 3 fights a year. And then Jorge Masvidal said, if I'm an independent contractor, I can't go anywhere else to make a living. Let me go and let me see what I'm worth. Exactly the same thing John Jones basically said last week. Now, we've now got Henry Cejudo, who relinquished his title and said, I'm retiring because I don't think I'm getting paid enough. You've got Jorge Masvidal at 170 pounds. You've got John Jones at light heavyweight. You've got Stipe Miocic, who's kind of in his own little standoff with the UFC. But it's weird because even though there's a group of fighters that are basically trying to make their own individual stand against the UFC, they're not doing it collectively. And I'm not trying to sit here and talk about a union and talk about a revenue split between fighters, and that's a whole different story. That's a whole different ball game. But that is the only way that a genuine change is going to be affected. Until then, you're going to have these little spats, and then at some point, the fighter's just going to lose their nerve and they're going to go back to work. The only fighter that I can think of, there's two fighters that I can think of that have managed to get the purses that they think they deserve, that are not in line with what everybody else earns. Conor McGregor. And the other guy is Nate Diaz, because he's actually willing to sit out for 2 years, 3 years. He's willing to just not fight. Fine, fuck it, I won't fight. Unless you're willing to go to those lengths, then these things on Twitter, they're not really going to work for you. Do you know what I mean? You got to put your money where your mouth is. Now, it's a shame for me as a fan, because I want to see Jorge Masvidal fight Kamaru Usman. That's a fight that I'd be looking forward to. If you ask me to make a list, that'll be in my top 10 of fights that I want to see this calendar year. Don't know why I said calendar there, but that's a fight that I'd want to see this year. But I'm not sure whether these things here on Twitter, I'm not sure whether they actually help you as a fighter. I'm really not sure. The other thing that I just quickly want to add is Dana White talks about, oh, look, we're in a pandemic. Other sports are trying to cut fighters' pay. I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that. Blah, blah, blah. He talks about the live gate, etc. You can't say that on one hand, then on the other hand, talk about how much of a success UFC 249 was, and talk about the 700,000 buyers that fight did. Justin Gaethje against Tony Ferguson, 700,000 buyers. Do you think that would happen in a normal time in humanity, like without a pandemic going on? Do you think that would happen if there was regular sports around the globe? Now, if you use that logic and you get this fight in July in International Fight Week, although it won't be International Fight Week, but you get that fight booked in for July before other sports in America really kick in. I don't know when they're kicking in. I know football in the UK is kicking in a couple of weeks. But you've literally got all eyes on you at the moment. While the sun's shining, it's time to make hay. And in this case, if you get this fight booked, you're going to do big numbers, I'd imagine. So maybe they're sitting there saying, here's your guarantee, and then you'll get this much off the pay-per-view, etc. These guys want that much off the pay-per-view, but they also want more in the guarantee, which is their prerogative. That's fine. That's how business goes. You value the services that you're providing, and if the person buying those services, in this case the UFC, aren't willing to pay that price, then you haven't got a fucking deal. What I'm saying is, I just don't know whether going on Twitter and talking shit about the UFC is really going to help you. Especially now that the UFC have maneuvered Gilbert Burns into that top slot, number 1 ranked. And you know an offer will be made to Kobe Covington sooner rather than later. You know that offer will be made. And you know that a fight between Kobe Covington and Kamaru Usman is going to garner the kind of interest you need for a title fight, because the first fight was a fucking good fight and it was close. And you can't sit here as an MMA fan say that you wouldn't want to see that fight again. I just don't look. I'm not trying to say Jorge Masvidal and his team shouldn't be negotiating with the UFC. I'm not saying they shouldn't try and get the money that they deserve, they think they deserve for that fight. Like I've always said, whenever I make a video, I want the fighters to make as much money possible, humanly possible. I want them to be paid as much as they fucking can get. However, have these managers not seen how things work in the UFC over the last 5-10 years? Do you know what I mean? Have they not seen what happens to people that try and pull this move? Dana White, it's not that he doesn't play ball. He just doesn't acknowledge it. He just doesn't acknowledge it. He just won't even acknowledge the fact that you're upset. He'll just say, well, we offered you a fight. That's all we're contractually obliged to do. And the fucking ship just keeps moving. And until these managers stop fucking fighting amongst themselves and they sit down with each other and then they say, look, we believe all fighters across the board need to be paid more than what they're getting at the moment. Like, people always talk about, oh, which fighter would you have lead the MMA union? Or who do you think should be part of the MMA union? All of this shit. For me, it should, like, the managers are the guys that fucking, don't even know why I said it like that. Managers are the guys that have a relationship with multiple fighters. So if you get 5 managers in a room and say, look, we need to do something about this because the UFC are constantly lowballing us. They're the ones that can start bringing fighters together, get people to sign on the dotted line and say, look, none of us are fighting until X, Y, and Z happens. But what do I know, eh? What do I know? It's a shame though, isn't it? It's a shame. I'd like to see Jorge Masvidal fight sooner rather than later. But judging by his tweets tonight, it don't look like it's going to happen anytime soon. Let me know what you guys think. Put your comments below. Don't be scared to hit the like button. Share this with a friend. Subscribe if you haven't already. Go in the description of the video. You'll see a whole load of links to different whole load of different links to my podcast. Click the one that suits you. Subscribe to my podcast. And hello, I've gained quite a few little subscribers this week because one of my videos caught some traction with with a homeless cat. So hello, how you guys doing? You right? And shout out to my nephews Rohan and Abe, who I saw today. They asked me to shout them out. I'm not sure why, because about 4 people will watch this, but shout out to you lot. Let's see if you made it to the end of the video. Anyway, catch you guys next time.